You know, it's probably inevitable. You get a little success underneath your belt. You make a name for yourself. You're actually wanted by the public for what you're able to do. And what comes up and hits you smack in the face right after that? Separation. The breakup. The dividing of assets. The split. Yes, it's true. Me and my dad are going our separate ways. For no other reason than common sense. We want to be able to work 2 markets instead of just 1. If you're just doing 1, all your eggs are in 1 basket. So if there's a traffic incident so customers can't get to you, or the weather's bad, or anything like that, you know, you lost everything for that weekend. By working 2 markets, there's a better chance that when something bad happens at one, you'll do okay in the other. But there's the even better chance that you'll meet twice as many customers, make twice as many sales, and get twice as many contacts for future things. So it just makes sense to try, if you can, to work as many markets on the same day as possible. But what that means is we had to get him an entire new setup. He went ahead and bought himself a really nice tent. He got himself a new display. Over the holidays, he bought himself a mini lathe versus that mini lathe that he did have. That's just a bit heavy to drag around to these kind of events. Which means, for today's project, we are going to build him a very nice Trestle style tool stand for his lathe. Which means the main focus of today's project is going to go into depth into using the mortise and tenon joint for torsional strength. So come along as we design a Trestle style tool stand. So, there we go. All the parts are now rough dimension so we can get at the joinery. Now, if you're using strictly hand tools, a lot of what you've seen me do is just cosmetic work, and you could probably skip it because this is just a shop appliance. But I have the tools, I was going to use them, make it a little nicer, quicker for me to get the rough dimensioning done. Oh, and by the way, if you're eyeing my t-shirt, I do have these on sale on my website. This is how I pay for videos such as this. So just visit wortheffort.com and throw a little shekels our way, and we'll send you a nice little t-shirt. Now, before we start cutting this stuff up, let's talk about mortise and tenon joinery. Now, I have to believe that the mortise and tenon joint is likely the oldest joint we have in woodworking, seconded only to tying 2 sticks together with a rope of hemp. I mean, seriously, sticking a pole in a hole dates back to the Adam and Eve age. And that's basically all we are doing even to today. I mean, look at a Windsor chair. Granted, tolerance is probably a lot tighter than just putting a piece of coal on a log, letting it burn a hole, and then hatcheting a branch that'll fit into there. I mean, we have tapers, all that kind of stuff, but that's basically all we are talking about. And because the mortise and tenon joint has so much glue surface, even the worst types of glues that they were using 100,000 years ago will prevent it from just pulling out of the joint. All the power of the Mortise and tenon joint is in torsion, trying to spread it apart. And even if you didn't use glue and just peg that tenon, that thing is now a mechanical joint. It's not coming apart. But there is a problem with just sticking a stick in a hole: the wood itself. We all know that wood is extremely hard on the end grain. I've got a 20-ounce hammer here, and I run my fingers across, and I don't see any indentation. Can you see any? Okay? Slight color change from polishing it, but that's about it. I come over to the long grain, and I hit it one time. There's a nice dent, nice smooth indentation all the way around. That is because we all know wood is extremely strong going up and down this way. But in compression sideways, because there's lots of holes in there, the holes will compress fairly easily. So it's not that hard to dent this way. So why is that a problem with the Mortise and tenon joint? The issue is, even though the Mortise and tenon joint is likely the strongest joint we have in woodworking, it is pitting long grain against end grain. And end grain will always win. You saw it is much, much harder. You have a typical Windsor chair joint where you have a pole with a conical setup. It goes into the hole. It is going to last a good long time, especially if this is grain wood and it shrinks on top of it. There's lots of adhesion going on. But you ever ask yourself why they tell you never to lean back in your chairs? Because that puts a lot of torsion, torque, onto these joints. And if you're twisting a Mortise and tenon joint, guess what's going to lose? The long grain. So the joint will loosen up, if not break. Same if you've got a square board going into a mortise. If you're fitting it just perfectly, the weak point is always going to be this long grain. There's a chance if you torque it, it is going to dent a little bit, and that joint will loosen up. So how can you get around that? One word: shoulders. I've always said that in furniture making, the strength of the Mortise and tenon joint isn't in the Mortise and tenon. It's in the combination of the tenon and its shoulders. Because all of a sudden you add a shoulder onto a tenon, you give the tenon itself a lot of end grain strength. Before, you just slid that board in, the end grain of the mortise reacted with the end grain of the tenon. But now, you slide that joint in, not only does the end grain of the mortise react with the tenon, but the end grain of the tenon acts with the sides of the mortise. So, as one is, in order to make this thing loosen up at all, you have to crush the long grain of a lot more wood. Now, is it possible to loosen up this kind of joint by wiggling it? Yeah, it is. But it takes so much more force because there's so much more surface area for the end grain to react with the long grain. Plus the fact that in order to this joint to loosen up, all you really had to do was dent a little corner on the top and bottom. Okay? Now, you not only have to dent this corner, you have to dent this corner right here, and then all this right here, and it's just a lot more difficult. So the secret to a Mortise and tenon joint that is going to have to react to torque is the shoulder. Okay, now let's look at table construction. You have a typical four-legged table using Mortise and tenon joinery into the legs on the skirt with a top on top. What kind of torsional torque effect is happening on those Mortise and tenon joints? You have a kid jumping up on one of these sides, basically that force is going straight down, straight into the legs. The transfer is straight down. So there's very, very little torque, which is why a Mortise and tenon joint, even without shoulders, is wonderful for legs. Now let's look at a trestle table. We have the base, we have a massive Mortise and tenon joint with a very large shoulder on the bottom and the top. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying the design, but you get what we're talking about. Now, somebody leans on this corner over here. All that weight becomes torque trying to compress this. It becomes an arc, and this joint now comes into effect. Without the shoulder, all it would have to do was dent the Mortise and tenon joint, and that table is going to loosen up and it's going to become dangerous. But because you have a large shoulder, there's so much more long grain compression that now needs to happen, not only here, but all along here, that it just works. It becomes overkill for the amount of torque that can be exerted by a typical human being on the edge. Now obviously you make your tabletop extremely long and it gets exponentially harder to do, which is why you don't use this kind of design for really wide tables. Long tables, okay. Wide tables, not so much. Which is why we're going to focus on how to cut the shoulders of a tenon in this video. Now there are a lot of different ways you can do it. You can do it on a table saw, you can even do them on a band saw. But the key thing is we want to make sure they are dead flat, so there's a lot of surface contact with the long grain and end grain on that shoulder, and they are perfectly square all the way around. There's no little gaps on there, because any gap will give it a better opportunity for loosening up. Now the design I came up with really only has one seriously difficult Mortise and tenon joint. That's the one that goes from the legs down into that bottom crossbeam section. I don't know what you call those. That one has to be dead on perfect. I have two more on these kind of braces with the middle stretcher. These top sections and where the top connects, those are really going to be more lap joints just for easier construction. And this is not going to be a high stressed trestle table because it's just holding a lathe, and a lathe isn't very wide. So we're going to focus on cutting the leg tenon into this bottom thingamajig that forms the base. Okay, the legs of my project are going to be made up of these boards, and because I only had some fairly thin stock and I really did want to have a little bit wider, what I did was I split them in half, and I'm going to cut 2 tenons per leg, and the legs are going to be made up of 2 boards down on bottom. Now, when I typically work, you saw me rough it out, I wasn't too concerned with the total length as long as I made it too long. Basically, what a lot of times I would do is I will cut my tenons long, because if you're cutting them by hand, sometimes, you know, if you have it fairly thin, they're a little bit more difficult, and it's easier to do longer tenons and cut off the end that's too long within the mortise. Besides, it's a lot of times straighter towards the bottom when you hand cut stuff than it is towards the top as you're getting your lines established. So it just makes it a little bit more accurate. So I've got extra wood on this leg, in other words. Now the first step to cutting a very clean shoulder is the layout. And this is where most people mess up. Now there are lots of different ways to lay out your marks. I'm going to give you an example. A lot of people I will see will assume that their boards are perfectly parallel. And if you've dimensioned them by hand, they might look parallel, but between one end and the other, if it's a 1/4 of a degree off, this is where you will find it. And we need that shoulder to be perfect all the way around. Also, what if your tools themselves are not perfect and we don't get them around? Now this is fairly accurate. So if you take it and do the marking like you see a lot of people do, you mark a line, you come back over, you lay your ruler down, you mark a line, you lay your ruler down, you mark your line, and you lay your ruler down and you mark a line. If anything happens along that timeline that gets you a little bit off, well, now I cannot have a shoulder that works my way all the way around. Now, I don't know if it was my tool or the board or what. So there's got to be a way to make a mark all the way around a board, even if we are a fraction of a degree off somewhere. Now, if we can get that all the way around, at least we can know we have a very parallel shoulder all the way around. And if the leg itself is standing up a quarter of a degree one way or the other, nobody will really ever know, and it won't affect performance that much. So we just need to make sure no matter what we get this shoulder right. So here's a trick I've learned. Let's say we have a perfect 90-degree marking gauge. A perfect 90 degree. And our only goal is to be able to mark a line all the way around. And we want to be very accurate. To be accurate, we're going to use a knife. Can't get a line more fine than that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to label one of these edges a reference edge. That right there is my reference edge. And if I can somehow just get all my lines to go in the same direction, I should be able, no matter what I do, to get this to make a continuous line all the way around. So here's my reference, here's my reference edge. The very first thing I do is I make a line along my reference edge. And what is oh, my wing nut. Okay, so I make a line on my reference edge. 1, 2, 3. I come around, I rotate around, and then I ask myself, is this side of the board or is this side of the board closest to my reference edge? Well, obviously because of a triangle, this side over here is the closest side. So my reference goes closest to my reference edge, and I will mark right here. I think some of y'all have already figured out what's happening now. Next up, I come over here. Which side, this side or this side, is closest to the reference edge? Well, quite obviously it's going to be this side. So now I take my reference and I flip it so it will be closer to the reference edge, and then I can put my knife in my knife line and make my mark. So, which side now? Here's my reference. Which of these sides is closest to the reference edge? Obviously, it's this one. So I put my reference closest to the reference edge. I put my knife in my knife line. Sorry, the little wing nut's in the way. I picked a bad board to do this demonstration with. I'll just have to hold it above there. And then I draw my line. And if I did it right, well, what do you know? My line, even though I used a very thin knife to do it, lined up perfectly. Now, if I do the same technique with something that I know is accurate, even if something's wrong with the board, at least I won't be amplifying the error every time I go around. I'm basically compensating for any error using this reference edge technique. So let's lay out this tenon. As I said earlier, I'm not too concerned where it's going to be at this point in time up from here. I've got lots of extra wood on that side. And I'm going to use my wooden square. I do have a video on how I make these if you want to check it out. So here we go. I'm just going to mark a line, and I'm going to mark a light line, barely kissing the wood the first time. Second time it's going to be a little bit harder. Third time a little bit harder, because I want to have a very deep line, a fine deep one. Next up, I'm going to flip it over closest to that first edge I started out with. Mark my line. Come back over, flip it, get closer to the reference edge, the first edge I started out on. And now finish it up. And I end up with a mark that is perfectly lined up all the way around. So I'm going to do the other three boards and come back. So I've got the shoulder laid out on all those. Not the tenon, just the shoulder. Now I'm going to lay out the shoulder for these. And these are going to be the cross sections that kind of brace the whole stand so it doesn't rock back and forth. And if you remember, I had an angle on these bottom sections. So how do you lay out that using that reference edge rule? What's exactly the same, except you're going to have one tool that's set to 90 degrees and another tool set to whatever angle you want. Just to make it easy, I'm going to do it at 45. So, what do? I come over, I identify my reference edge. I go ahead and mark it straight across. And then I place the reference on the reference edge and mark my angles. And I pick it up. Which side is now closer to the reference edge? This side or this side? Well, obviously this side. So I come over, I lay that down, I put my knife line in there, I bump it up, come straight across, and now this was my original reference edge, so that is now the closest line, so I bring my reference closest to the reference edge, and I mark straight across, dropping in that knife line. And if we do everything right, it will still line up all the way around. Well, what do you know? So, even though you're using that angle, all that requires you to do is use two different squares if you need one of them to be 90 degrees. Okay, so we got our lines marked around everything, even on the 45s. Now we got to lay out the tenons. And tenons, the general rule of thumb that I follow is you generally want your tenon to be about 1/3 the total width. That way you'll get 1/3 of a shoulder on each side all the way around. Now you can do all the math and stuff like that. I know my biggest pieces are probably right around 1.5 inches, a little bit over 1.5 inches. As you remember, I basically planed down a 2x4, and that's about probably close enough. I don't want to do a lot of math, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab my 1/2-inch chisel, kind of eyeball the center of it, give it a whack on one board, and then I'm going to set them all the same size. Just grab my marking gauge and make it just a tad bit bigger than that, meaning I'm going to not quite get up to that line. That way I know whenever I mortise out the hole, I can use this chisel and I'll have a little bit of slop. So just mark it all the way around that like that. Okay, so I've got my shoulders laid out and I've got my tenons laid out. And if you notice that the tenons are an equal distance, so it gives me a little tic-tac-toe board in the middle. This is like looking straight down on the board. Now my normal way of doing it is I will hand cut the shoulders because I want those to be very, very precise, and my table saw, being a contractor saw, has never been that good at being that precise. And well, really for a shop appliance, it's good enough, but I'm trying to show you how to be as accurate as possible. And whenever I make stuff I want to sell, this is the way I do it. I also will use my bandsaw to cut the tenon cheeks, just because I find it faster. And because I'm doing an equal distance on all sides, I basically only have to set my bandsaw up once and I can make all the cuts. Think ahead. Cutting the shoulder perfectly does take a little bit of finesse. And what I will typically do is I will start with my saw. I will generally start my saw on the far edge and saw across the top, only following one line at a time because I'm not that coordinated. I can't chew gum, walk, and talk at the same time. Then, once my saw is all the way across the top, I will saw down until I have that baseline. Notice I have not sawn any of that stuff. From there, I will rotate the board around, and then starting with the saw on this side, and I've already got kerf started in there for me to drop right into, I will basically saw down like that. Rotating it over, I will saw down like that. Rotating it over, I will saw down like that. And then from there, I will rotate it out, and I will flatten out the saw, taking the full spot, going all the way around, So basically, I work around the board twice in order to get the most accuracy. Now there is another way you can do that, is cutting a shoulder line, a V-notch on the shoulder line. I'm going to show that to you, but understand, I typically don't do that one because after 3 or 4 months of cutting shoulders, you can saw to the line. It's not that big a deal, but I'll show it to you now. So I've got my shooting boards. Always make your shooting boards in pairs so that the distance to the end is the same and the distance up from your bench is the same. That way you can extend stuff out and it just makes life a lot easier. Okay? From here, I'm going to grab my chisel, and starting on this side, because I made a very deep knife line, I can create a little V-notch. And this V-notch is basically going to give your saw a place to drop into. You basically have a ramp on one side and a 90-degree knife wall on the other side. That way, if you're off a little bit up the ramp, it's going to slide down and hug up against this line. The trick to using that, though, is you want to kind of keep the teeth below that knife line in that V cut. That way they don't hop on top and you can maintain your really crisp line. And from here, I'm just going to saw down a little ways until I hit about that line. It doesn't have to be too accurate. But notice I now have that curve right there. And if you did the V-notch all the way around, it would be easier. I've already got that curve started and it's right on the line, so I'm just going to do the same thing, following my knife line, coming down. Do the same thing here. And you ever wonder why they have these handles that are curved on bottom? Because your saw is going to hit the your thing really easily, and it's going to notch out. So it just makes life a little bit easier. Really cool engineering in saws. Okay, come back over. Nice long strokes. Use your finger to keep it against the knife line. Come down, rotate. And now this is going to now fall into that original saw curve. And now that you have a relief, the saw itself is going to want to go straight, because the saw wants to follow the path of least resistance, and you've created that wall right there. So the deeper you go, it just wants to stay at 90 degrees. Real simple. And I know it's a lot of rotating, but I'm doing a lot of talking. It actually does go a lot quicker when you're just doing it straight on. So once again, I lay down my knife line. This time I'm not using a V-cut. I'm just going to lay my fingernail in that knife line, come back over, come back down, work my way across the top, keeping my saw in that one corner on this side, and it'll take me going straight up and down as long as I follow that line on the other side. All you gotta do is follow one line at a time. Make it easy on yourself. Rotate it around, saw down. Whoops, got a little off the line. I can back it back up, come back down, get to my spot. There we go. And I'm now in my original saw curve, so I can just practically look at the camera and not even focus on anything except stopping at my line. Easy peasy to get accuracy once you know the technique. So follow along as I cut the cheeks on my bandsaw and we build the rest of it. there we go, the finished product, a Trestle style lay stand. And my dad has my lay stand while I was building this one for him, so I had to use this today and put it through its paces. It's already got a few scuffs in it, but this is a working shop tool. You'll notice that the lathe is somewhat centered over the center of the trestle stand. That keeps you a lot more balanced with the motor and the other equipment right over there. And there's extra space on this side, and we've extended the ledge a little bit because my dad wants to be able to drill holes in the top and drop that down in there. Now, I did do some sculptural work on it to not only lighten it up, but just to make it look better. And I was playing around and having a little fun. I was thinking I was going to sculpt the top a little bit, but on second thought today, I decided I'm just going to leave it blank because I screwed it down for a reason. I wanted us to be able to replace this in future years if he wanted to have a different tool collection, drill different holes or whatever. So it'd be very easy to replace this with just another flat board. Unscrew it and we'll be happy there. All the other joints are the Trestle style Mortise and Tenon joints I used on the bottom that we discussed in our video. And we did some half lap joints, full lap joints, some more Mortise and Tenon joints, and all of those were fully pegged so that in case the glue fails for whatever reason, there is some kind of mechanical reinforcement. So all that's left for my dad to do is he wanted to put his own feet on the bottom so that he can screw them up and down so he can balance it if he's ever on concrete. And he's going to drill his own holes. Personally, if this is mine, I would just drill 1-inch holes on the bottom of each one of these legs, drive a 1-inch dowel into there, level it out. That way I can replace those as I get beat up over time. But you don't want to have a full stretcher like this sitting on ground because it's never going to be flat and you don't want it to rot. But I will tell you this, after using this today, racking, this thing is solid. It's good design, I think, if I do say so myself. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. Maybe learned a few tricks along the way. And if you did, please consider supporting us by liking, favoriting, subscribing, doing all those social medias. Visiting our website, wortheffort.com, where not only do I have the cool t-shirts I mentioned earlier, I have new designs coming out all the time. They're all based upon charcoal drawings I do. And sometimes I'll put a little time lapse up in the corner of the video to show you how they are actually created. But we also have some shop-made tools like stuff you see me use on all the time available on occasion. But there's lots of other ways you can patronize us and see more educational content via blogs and articles. And if you visit YouTube, I'm really working on a classroom series of videos. There's a playlist out there on hand tool woodworking skills that not only reinforce academia for teens and middle schoolers, but go into a lot more detailed explanation for adults just getting into the hobby that want to learn the basics and refine their skills. Again, it's under the classroom series in our YouTube playlist. And I want you to remember one last thing. It is always worth the effort to learn, create, and share with others. Y'all be safe and have fun.